immigrants are people with residence permits. They are accepted in our communities by our governments. So they fit a particular category of people. And as a result, they qualify for the different support, government support, and child support, or whatever it may be. They have their own developed networks as well, extensive networks, and that's one group of people. And what we're particularly looking at this morning are asylum seekers. And these are people who do not yet have a status. They've applied for status to immigrate to a country, to receive some kind of acceptance in the country, but it's not yet determined. And in Europe, that process lasts a long time. And as we go through the slides, I want to point out that we'll look at that process briefly. So they leave their countries for a lot of complex reasons, for a host of reasons, and often they're very mixed up. It's just not one simple black and white answer as to why someone has left. They leave for economic reasons, they leave for religious reasons, political reasons, social reasons. So there's a whole gamut of reasons why they leave. And it's all mixed in together. And it reflects just the complexity of this issue. While they are asylum seekers, they have limited access to assistance. The EU has, and we'll look at that. That's what this page that I sent around that traces some of the development of the policy. And they have policy to try to help address some of the issues, for example, of assistance and how much the country should assist asylum seekers. Most of these people are poor. And probably less than half of the asylum seekers in Europe, slightly less than half, are Muslim. And all of the asylum seekers are very vulnerable. In fact, when we talk about our work and what we do, we talk about it in general in terms of a shared story that refugees have. And that story is one of vulnerability, for example. And so we actually, you can talk with refugees and asylum seekers from different countries, and their story is very similar in that regard. Last year, there was a conference or congress for organizations that do relief and development among refugees, and they shared this graph here to show the sort of the life of a refugee, the life of someone who goes through a crisis, and where that intervention comes in, and sort of their level of normalcy. So they go through a crisis, and in that crisis, then their level of normalcy, which I show by the red line there. I define the red line as a level of normalcy. They go through a crisis, and they drop down. And at that point, relief and development organizations, large ones like World Vision or the UNHCR, these big institutions, they kick in relief and development, and a lot of relief and relief aid. And that's where you normally think about reaching out to and assisting refugees, is at this point right here. And it's fairly easy to understand what they need. They need tents, they need places to live, they need food, they need clothing. And it drops down, and then they bottom out here. And by this point right here, all of that aid, all of that attention, all of that assistance for recovering a normal life is finished. And our work, and I believe the work of the church, needs to kick in at this point. And what we are doing as an organization, and a lot of what I want to share this morning, is from this point on. And the church is well equipped, is the best equipped to really reach and walk with these people from this point on. And it's a long journey at that point. So we often describe our work that we do as one of helping people to recover their lives and to rebuild their lives. And that's a work that extends for several years and can extend a lifetime. So that's just a visual and a way of helping you to understand a little bit more as well of what I do and how I see my assistance and my work with asylum seekers. It's really about helping them to rebuild their lives and reestablish their lives. I want to begin with looking at a few of the demographics related to migration. And I realize that these might be figures and graphs that we're all familiar with. One key source for me is the Eurostat on the Europa website, the EU website, the homepage. And one section of that is information dedicated to the Eurostat. And this is where these figures come from. This is immigration in the EU. And so you see on the left, those coming into the EU are approximately 2 million people, and that's immigrating into the EU. And then across the bottom, you can see the different countries. And then the graph on the right is showing those leaving the EU. And I think this helps us to see the reality as well a little bit. So there's what's important is the net migration that's involved. And so people might be concerned that there are 2 million people coming into the EU, but there's 1 million people that are leaving. And I highlighted as well, for example, each country is different, of course. And so here on the right, you see in the Czech Republic, they have approximately 50,000 people that left in the year 2012. And if you look over here, immigrating in the Czech Republic, there were fewer people coming into the country. And in Germany, it was reversed. Germany is one of the highest countries traditionally that receives immigrants. And in that same year, fewer people left. So again, the point behind these graphs, this shows, is to help us see the reality of this, because I think that people base a lot of their opinions and their concerns on myths and on less than the truth. Yes? Her question is whether the figures include immigration internal to the EU and within the EU. The Eurostat figures, I think, include those numbers as well. But I have some graphs coming up that distinguish between the two figures, between those who are immigrating within the EU and those who are immigrating from outside the EU. So I have that coming up. But this is an interesting one as well. The lighter figures have a net migration, a net value, and the darker ones.
More people coming in and going out.
Other way around. More people going out, and the darker areas are more people coming in. And all of this is from the Eurostat page, the home page of the EU. So this gets to the question of internal migration and immigration within the EU or outside the EU. So for example, on the left, these are people from outside the EU as well as those within the EU. And this one is showing purely those from outside the EU who immigrate in and those and it's showing the different religious groups. This is from the Pew Research website, and you can find these graphs on that website there. So you see, for example, that's why I say a little less than half are Muslim, as opposed to Christian. So you can see the Christians who are coming in, or the Muslims. So the reality is that there are more Christians, of course we're talking about traditional Christians, coming in as opposed to Muslims. And then from the same Pew Research Center, they have these statistics related more specifically to Muslim migration into Europe, and they distinguish it by Western, Southern, Northern, Eastern Europe. I suppose they only had data from Bulgaria, which is interesting. Bulgaria has the highest percent. This was, I think, from 2011, January 2011. But apart from Bulgaria, France has around 7%. I think this corresponds to what some others earlier have shared also. So that's just immigration in general. And now let's look more closely at asylum seekers and those numbers in the EU. And this graph is showing tracking the number of asylum applications in the EU from 1998 to 2012. 335,000. Last year, in 2013, there were 443,000. So the number is going up, and the trend is going up as well. So it's approaching like it was earlier. It's going up here. And these are applications in the EU. About 72% are rejected. So these are first-time applications, and we'll see the process in a little bit. They have a chance to appeal that, and they're not tracking the appeals and how many applications are still in the process from previous years. It's purely tracking the first-time application.
72% are rejected.
Yes. Yes.
So what do the people who are rejected do? They stay behind?
Most of them will appeal. Their process will appeal for a second decision, and then if that's rejected, they will overstay their visa. They won't leave. They become irregular migrants at that point and go underground. They become. They are rejected in the EU, also all 27, 28 countries. Together, the total percentage is about 70% that are rejected.
If they are
Yes.
rejected in one country, do they have the possibility to go?
No, and we'll look at some of that as well on this sheet that I gave you. So this is showing the share per country, so you can see Germany has the most. Again, this is, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. Germany has 23% of the applications. And you can see the other countries, and then the other EU states are here. So these states here represent 71% of the applications, and these other states represent about 30% of the applications.
72% are rejected.
And yes, which is another matter from this. Now it helps to visualize, and I added this to it. This is also an infographic from the Europa homepage. You can find this right there and download it. It's about 12 pages long, and these are just some screenshots I took. This is moving down, and it shows the actual countries. If anyone wants to actually see a figure for the country, you can see that there. But you may not be able to read it. For Austria, yes. The first one is Austria with 17,000 applications. And then Italy. And this would have been the year that they had the North African crisis. So this would be reflecting a lot of those.
It's gone back, it's gone back to being that way in spite of
Yeah. So, and then after that, there's the Netherlands, and this is Poland, and Greece, Denmark, Finland. And this is again from the Eurostat page. People always ask, oh, well, what refugees do you work with? I think we're really geared and focused on people groups. And when I work with refugees, in general, you go into an asylum seeker home or a place where people are living or an area, and they're mixed in together. They might be divided into rooms, Afghans and Iranians or Somalis in separate rooms and spaces, but they're all mixed in together. And so I'm working with all these people here. And when a church is interested in reaching out to the asylum seekers in the area, that's what you're doing. And so no one people group there represents hardly more than 10% of the total asylum seeker population. No, it's not a surprise now. So these would be the most recent stats from December 2013. So, right, Syria is on top there. Let's see what's next. Okay, so I want to give you an overview of the asylum process in the EU, and then we're going to look a little bit at how that's developed in this handout I gave you. So I've already said about 72% receive a negative, and that means less than a third really have received a positive to immigrate on their first application, first instance. So I think what the EU has tried to do is just to give a very broad parameter for understanding and helping to address the issue of asylum and citizenship and immigration in the EU. But it's really important to emphasize that each country is responsible for how it's going to reflect this policy. And so each country is a little bit different with regards to how they address asylum seekers in their country. So for example, in Austria and Germany and Switzerland, where I'm familiar with the system also, the government gives places for refugees, asylum seekers to live. And so it's much easier. It was always easy for me to go into an area and know I can go there and I can contact asylum seekers and I can go into this house and offer a language course or some kind of program, and it's much easier. Whereas in France, they don't offer housing for asylum seekers. They have housing available, but it's the same housing that they offer for socially dependent people in the whole country. So the asylum seekers are mixed in basically with the social system, and so the asylum seekers will have a caseworkers from the social services that are helping homeless French people as well as asylum seekers. And so there's a much less. You have a sense that in France there's less awareness of the issues and they're less able to address the issues. And it's also much more difficult as an outsider to know how to help because it's just not so defined so well. So for example, the people don't have places to live in France. So the process basically, a person enters the EU and they are given the basic needs that they have, but then they are in France, they're then released on their own. If France is not able to offer housing for them, which is usually the case, then they are released on their own and they have to find a place to live or live with friends or come together and rent something. And a lot of people end up living on the streets. They receive a date for an interview, and that's where they give their story. And that's where the officials begin to process that and decide whether it's a valid, this person has a valid need for protection or not. And then if it's rejected, they have one chance for an appeal And if it's accepted and approved, then they, at that point, immigrate. And they receive a status to stay in the country. And then at that point, they can begin to access some of the more normal kinds of the social assistance that we think of. So up until this point, it can be anywhere from 9 months to several years, depending on the country, depending on the system. I think generally when people think of refugees, I think they are afraid of what they mean for the country, and I think it's really important to emphasize that. From my experience, I've found just very few refugees who have a radical bent and are leaning in that way. As asylum seekers or refugees, generally they're fleeing those very, very things that have the oppression of Islam or persecution from a government, and so they are looking for peace and for safety, as opposed to trying to live in an unpeaceful and create a violent situation. But I think the myth, like so much of what we hear, is in Europe, is people think that the asylum seekers are taking our jobs, are becoming a burden on the society, and they would point to something like this as an example. This was one of the bombers in London in 2007. One of those terrorist attacks that have happened. There's been a series of attacks over the years, and one of them involved these refugees. And so this feeds the phobia that the general public have of outsiders coming in to our society. Maybe this is helpful, just going back to radicalization. As I've thought about how radicalization and asylum seekers relate and where it is, the point that I'm making is that the policy development in the EU can foster radicalization. It can foster an antagonism towards the state and towards Europeans. It can foster a deep disagreement, sadness for being in Europe, for knowing Europeans, and for what has happened to them. And so I want to look at how that happens. And you can see when I look back at some of the ways that we've talked about radicalism, some of the characteristics that come out in my mind are exclusive attitudes, a violent behavior. So there's a story of violence in their lives, and they're participating in that. There's a characteristic of non-compatible. We're not compatible with Europe. Our culture is different. We are different. They're different. And as a result of all this, many people are alienated throughout the whole thing. So these are some of the characteristics that I've picked out as I think about radicalization. And my point that I want to discuss, and we can discuss that together, is to what extent does the development of EU's policy foster these kinds of characteristics? So just to look at the broad strokes of this policy development. Let's just we won't go through all of them, but look at the left, starting there. The whole idea of asylum is based on the Human Rights Declaration, 1948 in the EU. And then in 1951, you have the issue of establishing and defining, well, who should receive asylum and whose rights should be protected. Does everyone have a copy? So then 1951, you have the Refugee Convention, and connected with that was a revisit to that, basically to in 1967 to just clarify that it's also breaking someone's right when they're returned to their home country, which is an issue here when the EU, if the EU is trying to return people who have genuine protection needs. So that's where we begin on the left there. And then moving to the right in 1985 is the Schengen Agreement, which basically establishes the common EU room and the idea of open borders, the idea that there can be business and commerce and exchange and travel within the EU, and there should just be one common border on the outside of the EU. So then in 1990, the Dublin Convention begins to address the question, well, what about people who come in to the EU and begin to asylum shop? And they apply for one application of asylum in one country, and then they realize in another country it may be better. And so they begin to have two applications going on, and that was happening. So how can we address that? So the Dublin Convention began to address that and establish the point that there can only be one asylum process. In 1999, then is when this whole common European asylum system was begun. And then in 2003 is the Dublin II, which revisits the Dublin Agreement, and it's trying to bring more control to the issue because a person will come into the EU and they've established only one country will give you asylum. So everyone was looking at the best country to go to. So they established that the first point that you enter in the EU, that's the country that you should apply and should give you asylum or not. They should go through that process of deciding your asylum. So again, they were trying to bring more control into what was happening and the influx. In 2004, they established two important things that are used now is the Eurodac regulation, which allows for fingerprinting, and so all the asylum seekers are fingerprinted, and so this establishes the interrogation process, the kinds of things that they should focus on, and they should ask about when they receive the stories. And then the Frontex was established there, which was again a way of improving the management and control of the border around EU. And then we can skip here. Just in 2013, what's happened then is, so refugees end up in Greece, or Malta, or Italy, Spain, at the frontiers of Europe, and those countries are not implementing the process well, or the refugees are experiencing just a high degree of detention and difficulty. And so they've revisited this to address how this whole Dublin system is failing. And so they've tried to address and tried to improve the system so that the countries will share the burden more. And that's what happened last summer. It still remains to be seen whether they are going to be able to, whether this is going to actually address some of the issues. So the issue is basically that the people, the asylum seekers, are experiencing unfair and unjust process of application in these countries. The system is ineffective and not able to provide the kinds of needs that the EU has recognized and wants to be able to address and provide. And at the same time, the EU recognizes it needs to share the burden more among its members, rather than all in one place. So that's where we stand now in this whole process. So this is a broad overview. I didn't mention all of it, and there's more besides these, of course. And I think it's important to, as we read this and look at it, it's really important to understand that the EU has the idea, and rightly so, that the states are the ones responsible for implementing this policy, and they're the ones who will set their own parameters in terms of how they will implement the policy. And each state, therefore, is different in terms of how it interprets the policy. So I want to look at this, if I could summarize myself just as I give an overview or a summary of this development as I see it, some trends and some characteristics that I see that have developed or that are happening with regards to the EU policy, is there is an externalizing of the issues. And so first you have the need to establish outside borders to keep people out of Europe who don't belong in. And as you go down the timeline towards the end, you even have agreements that are now in effect and recommendations by the EU that aid to countries should be limited and controlled by the degree to which that country participates in the EU's plan to keep people out that are unwelcomed. And so the EU is trying to do that. They have established task forces in crises, like in the North African, where police were mobilized and people were mobilized to address the issue and to help move people out of the EU and return them. There are policies like that. So there's a trend to externalize the issue and to see that the issue belongs out there, doesn't belong we don't deal with it. It's out there. It needs to be dealt with outside of the EU. There's an increase in policing as well. And we see this among the asylum seekers regularly, especially if asylum seekers don't have papers because their process is finished, or they've left Italy or Greece because it's going nowhere after 3 or 4 years. They come to France, they don't have papers there. So then the police at that point will use harsh methods and will just harass them with continual identity checks every day, checking their identity when the police already know what this person is or who they are. They'll randomly take them and put them into detention. They'll take them out into the countryside, many kilometers away from where they are staying, and just leave them, take them out. There have been cases where the police are asking for their cell phones and they'll crush them, they'll throw them into water. And so these kinds of harassment procedures. In Belgium, I once even heard of refugees that were attacked by police dogs, so the police will go in with police dogs, and the refugees were attacked. I saw the wounds on one arm, one refugee. So there's an increase in the policing methods. There's an increase in othering practices. What do I mean by that? I mean that these are practices that we use to build boundaries around ourselves. And we look at the other person. So in the refugee world, labels are very important. So you label this person as a criminal or as illegal. Criminals don't do legal activity, so we don't want anything to do with illegal people. And so we have these practices that are happening around us in order to define ourselves as a country or as a nation. So it's really about nationalism that's on the increase, and the degree of ethnocentrism in Europe, the degree of of building our identity as a people at the expense of minorities, at the expense of this other person. So we other that person. They are something other than what we are. And so there's an increase, I see an increase of these kinds of practices. Basically where the EU is and I'm speaking in general terms, is concerned to keep out these others who are poor or who would be a threat to our way of life, into our system, into our society. And then finally, there is a declining concern for human dignity, for the dignity of a person. And I would point to several ways that I see this happening. One is in the increase in detention. So you can see here the graph on the left, in 2001, the number of detention centers. This is a map showing where the detention centers are in the EU. And you can see the increase from 324 to 430. And this map is also distinguishing whether they are mixed in with the normal security prison system in those institutions, or whether they are separate detention centers for asylum seekers. I was visiting, I'll go and visit the asylum seekers that are undeclared or undocumented. They don't have their papers in our area. And I was visiting in one place where some guys were living, where there's about 50 people. I know they gather in this area, and the French are great at organizing humanitarian help, and there are a number of groups that are concerned for these issues, and they're humanitarian associations. And so I'll go, and these associations provide food for these people, and they'll send a doctor into the area where they know the guys are living once a week on a regular basis. And in some places, they even organize ways for the people to take showers and to stay healthy. So the French have been very active in that way. These are humanitarian groups, and I take part in a bike ride the past years, and we ride around northern France and in Belgium, visiting these different locations. And on that, so there are a lot of activists who take part, maybe 30 to 50 of us who ride together on this bike tour. And most of them, I'm the only Christian that I know of on this tour. And so most of them are from groups like Amnesty International and different Terre d'Asile, so groups in France that are concerned for asylum issues. And I was speaking with one man, explaining to him what I do in terms of visiting asylum seekers, and I was helping him explaining that I want to mobilize and help activate the churches for this issue, so that they are coming and also involved in these issues, because it's really important for them to have a voice as well, and to be involved and to be aware of what's happening. The man looked at me and shook his head and just simply said, "That's bizarre. That's bizarre that the church would want to be involved in an issue like this." And as we were visiting one man in one place, these refugees, this man who was from Iran, we were in this little space, and there were 5 guys in there, and they were just speaking to us about their situation, and one man was squatted in the corner and just looking down. And I began to think, this guy is traumatized, just sort of looking down and not responding or interacting at all. And finally, I was just in the middle of the conversation, he stood up and blurted out, no detention, no detention, like this. And his other friends sort of calmed him down. The conversation went on another couple sentences, and he blurted out again, no detention, no detention. Another guy offered him a cigarette. And finally, he broke out into tears and said, no detention, no detention. and his experience then, he had been in detention, had traumatized him, because often what will happen is it will remind them of the trauma they've already been through. It triggers this past trauma. And so detention is not an effective way for dealing with the asylum issues. This is an important report that's just come out. And they say in the report themselves that they are amazed that this is a report on the discrimination in the EU. And they say in the report they're amazed this is the first time that there is an EU-wide report. So it's providing a baseline for understanding discrimination and the degree and what's happening with regards to discrimination. It's also on the Europa website. It's a lot there to get into, but it's here, this one that relates to Muslims. It's discrimination against North Africans. And that is this one right here. And the survey surveyed about 23,000 people all over Europe. And so there was the discrimination rate. So the rate of, so when a person said, yes, I've been discriminated against in the past 12 months, the rate for North Africans, and you can see in Belgium it's 34%, in France it's 25%, in Italy it's 52%. 52% of the respondents have been discriminated against. And on the right, the number of crimes that have been committed against them. It's showing in Italy, for example, 36% of the people responded that they've actually been criminalized by someone, or someone has acted against them. So, yes.
What is the difference between a discrimination rate and a victimization rate?
So discrimination is someone just, yes, I've been discriminated on the buses. Someone cursed me.
But that anybody that was victimized had been discriminated against, and yet the victimization rate is higher.
Well, they do explain the victimization are the crimes against them. So they've been attacked brutally. So they've been attacked in a fight. I think that's the most that they refer to right here. So these were crimes. Whereas if someone doesn't get up, if you sit down on a bus and someone moves away, that's not a crime, but you are discriminated against.
And there's more crime than there is discrimination according to the
No, there's more. There are more instances of discrimination. People reported more instances of discrimination.
But I'm looking at both.
These are sub-Saharan Africans, and these are North Africans. Yeah, sorry. These are sub-Saharan Africans, which for me was really significant because they took the figures for sub-Saharan Africans purely from Malta. So just to conclude, I think I have how many minutes? 5 minutes. Just to make my point and to end. So we've gone through these trends that I see. The asylum policy is the direction it goes in, and if you compared that with, I can trace the parallels to radicalism. So where you have exclusive attitudes, you have a violent narrative, you have this non-compatibility, you have an alienation in relationships. And I met with one guy once from Sierra Leone, and he was explaining about his situation as well and how he's experienced some of these discriminations, particularly at work, where they're given extra work to do and told to come in longer or to work longer, and they have no recourse because they'll lose their job if they stand up against it. or they are mobbed at work. And so if someone's working in a hotel room, hotel cleaning, and the other workers, one woman was reporting how she was, the other workers basically pushed her out of work. On the buses, people will be discriminated against. These are the kinds of stories that people will mention. And this one guy was talking about this, and he said, you know, now, if I were in my country and there was a white person who came to my country, we would treat him like a king. We would never treat a person the way that I've been treated here. And now, in fact, if I go back to my country, I would treat them the way that they treated me. And so, and he went on to explain that he had friends who even said that they would kill the white man they saw in their country. And so this violent narrative is possible to come up. You can see that developing as a result of the policy.